So this video is about teaching grammar and teaching vocabulary. So I'm going to start with about teaching grammar and then move into vocabulary. When teaching grammar, so when you talk about teaching grammar or learning grammar, the thing that most people think automatically is, oh my gosh, that's so boring. And that will happen with your kids if you say, hey, we're going to do grammar. Your kids are going to be like, we don't want to do that. So when you're teaching grammar, how you know if a student has actually learned the grammar topic is if they're using it in their independent speech or an independent writing. So if they are using it in non-structured writing and speaking. So if you're having a conversation with them and they use the grammar, that is how you know that they understand it and that they're going to use it properly. This has a lot to do, learning grammar has a lot to do how you learn your native language as a baby. So if you think about it, when we are young and we're learning how to speak, if it's English or whatever your native language is, you don't have someone with a chalkboard over your crib and saying, okay, well in the present tense we do. No, you learn it by listening and then eventually trying it out yourself and speaking and then keep, repeating that process until you have it right. That's why a lot of times in your native language, if, someone asks you what the present perfect tense is, you don't know because you never had to study it like that. The same goes for when you're learning another language. It all has to do with the brain and how you learn languages. So if something is in the passive part of your brain, it means that you're not able to access it without going and thinking, okay, so for instance, if you're learning conjugations in Spanish and you know the grammar rules, so you know with yo, I, the verb ends in an O, and you're talking to someone and you want to say, I talk, you would have to go to the passive part of your brain and you'd have to be like, okay, with yo, it ends in O, so with hablar, it'd be hablo. And so that's really not what you want your kids to be doing. Instead, you want it to be in the active part of their brain. So the same way that when you are speaking your native language, you don't have to think about the grammar rules. You just know what's right. You know what sounds right, and you know what it feels right when you say it. That is what we ideally want them to be doing with grammar in English. So how do you do this? First of all, you don't have to be a grammar whiz to teach grammar. Like I said, in English, if you ask me certain tenses, I'd have to Google them. When I've taught grammar in the past, and I taught it incorrectly, because again, this is based on a teacher training that I took 2.5 years into my teaching career. Before that, I was Googling grammar tenses, and I was like, I don't know what that is. You just have to understand it so that you can teach it to the kids. So if it means you have to Google it, that's fine. The books usually also have it laid out for you so that you'll know what it is that you're trying to teach. And then the other big thing is that you don't want to walk into the grammar class and say, hey, we're going to learn grammar, everyone, because kids will immediately shut down. So the best way to teach grammar, in my experience as far as I know, is a 4-step structure. So this is also for anyone who's done TEFL or CELTA. Sometimes it's called the PPP structure. Present, practice, produce. It's the same idea. I just call it exposure, controlled practice, execution, and then assess at the end. I've just added the assess in just to make sure because it's necessary. So the idea of teaching grammar is that you want to start it with students, teacher-centered, and then eventually be moving more to student-centered. So what that means is that, initially it's going to be you leading the class a lot, and then it's going to move into them producing things more independently. The other thing to be aware of when teaching grammar is that you need to mirror each step. So for instance, if in the first step you only present it verbally, you can't in the second step expect the students to be able to write it properly. If you want them to be able to write it properly, you have to present it in the first step verbally, written, in listening activities, all kinds of things so that then they're able to mirror that. Okay. Sorry, not sure why that cut off. As I was saying, though, you mirror it in each step. Okay. So, the basic structure of the step. So the first step is exposure. So this is exposing students repeatedly to the grammar point. You are presenting it in the same way that we learn language. So you have nothing written on the board, no pattern presented, and you're not saying, okay, now it's time for a grammar topic. Instead, what you're doing is you are presenting it through drilling and repetition, and then you're also using it in any activity that you do that week. So a reading activity, a listening activity, a speaking activity, just in any type of activity you're doing. So one of the biggest ways that you will present this is through drilling and repetition. With the older kids, this sounds strange, but I promise that it works. So basically, it's with drilling, what you would do is, if I am trying to teach you, just for instance, that with I, you, we do not put an S on the end of a verb in present tense, and with he, she, it, we do. Okay? So I would say, I run, and the kids, and then you would gesture for the kids to repeat, and they would say, I run, she runs, we run, he runs. So you would literally just repeat it back and forth in a call and answer way, and that's called drilling. What that does is it gets the kids hearing it and practicing saying it. So as I was saying before, it sounds right to them, and it feels right when they say it. Then you would do discussions with the grammar topic. You'd use it in any warm-ups, like I was saying, readings, and you never have to tell them what they're doing. They don't have to know. Okay, so sorry about that, but as I was saying, with drilling, so and the exposure step, you never have to tell the students that you're doing a grammar lesson. You just start including it in everything you do. And you can also be at different steps with different grammar points. So you can be at the exposure step with one grammar point, and then you can be moving on to another step with the next grammar point. So the second step is controlled practice. So these are controlled activities, but that you're also continuing to present and incorporate the grammar point and other things while you're doing this to increase familiarity. So a controlled activity is when there's one right answer. So this would be a multiple choice, a fill in the blank, those kinds of things. And then you really do want accuracy because you want to help them notice the patterns. So as I was saying, you never give them the rules, but during this step, you ideally hope that they start noticing them. In the controlled practice step, you could still be doing the exposure step. So you can still be drilling and repeating, and you're still going to be including it in reading activities, listening activities, speaking activities, all of that. So this is the step where you might be able to elicit the pattern from the students. So the students at this point might be able to give you the pattern. So with the example that I was talking about, they might say, hey, miss or mister, with he, she, it, we put an S. That is ideally what you want. You don't want to give them the rule. You want them to give it to you. The third step is execution. So this is going to be when the students start independently producing the grammar point on their own. So this would be open-ended activities, so writing sentences, speaking, things like that, where there's not just one right answer, but where the students are having to use the grammar point. You can also give at least one homework assignment using the grammar point during this part, because it can kind of give you more of a sense as to how well the students are able to produce it independently if they're having to do it for homework. At this point, you can elicit the rule from them, and if you need to, you can, for the weaker students, you can always put it up on the board or something like that so they can copy in their notebooks just for the weaker students. But the idea is that you only put the rule up when they give it to you. You never give it to them at any point. The fourth step is assess. So this is just giving feedback and assessing whether or not they fully understand the grammar. You would be doing this for any activity really that you do anyway. Feedback is always important when you're doing any kind of activity with the kids. And you can be assessing throughout the process. When you assess, so for instance, if you give a quiz or during exams, and you think they should be at the execution stage, so you think they should be able to be independently producing this grammar topic, and you do the assessment and you realize that they're not at that stage, you can go back to the controlled practice stage. The same is true as if you do an assessment at the controlled practice stage and you realize they're not ready for that, you can go back to the first step. So never be afraid to go backwards. It's always more important that they learn the information than that you push through when they're not ready, when they're not at the point that they should be. So the whole idea of presenting grammar is through guided discovery. So this means that you're showing, not telling them, and then having them tell you. What this does is it encourages students to be curious and to learn by doing. It does involve more work outside the classroom, the same thing as I was talking about with differentiation, but less stress and work within the classroom, and is overall more successful. So that is what we want. You can sort of think of it as if you're constructing a building. So you start off with a lot of scaffolding, and then bit by bit, as the building becomes stronger, you pull that scaffolding away. And that's essentially what you're doing with this. What else? The other thing I always like to mention with grammar is you don't have to modify your speaking. So the same way that I probably don't say cannot very frequently, I say can't. We want the kids to be able to speak English that they will actually be using. We don't need them to be speaking formally correct intellectual English. We need them to be speaking English that they would be able to communicate with someone. So contractions are fine because that is how we talk. You can explain to them, for instance, that cannot is the same thing as can't, but that can is just the shortened form. That's fine. But you can just teach how we speak, as long as it's correct. Okay, so that is the grammar. It's not super intuitive, so if you ever have questions about how exactly to teach a certain grammar thing, we can always discuss that as well. So vocabulary. If you're using the footprints books, so the younger grades are using the footprints books, they do have vocabulary laid out pretty well for you. So you don't have to choose the vocabulary words as much as you would. With the older kids and the youngest kids, you will be choosing vocabulary words to a certain extent. So ideally, you're going to teach between 5 to 10 vocabulary words a week. I would say third grade and up, you're probably going to do 10. The younger kids, you could be doing 5, excluding kinder and prep who aren't quite ready for that yet. What some people choose to do and what I choose to do is you present the words on Monday, and then on Friday you have a vocabulary quiz. So one of the ways that is I've found to do this, when you get to the older kids and the words are a little bit more complicated, it's a little bit more difficult, but if you can associate an image with each word. So for instance, right now with 5th grade, we're doing places. So we have the pharmacy, we have the cafe, we have the library, and I associate an image with each of those, and then we use those images and words throughout the week in everything that we do. And then on Friday, I will give them a quiz where they have the pictures and they have to write the word correctly next to it. So what this does is it reinforces that these words are the ones that they actually have to be remembering and to know, because then, especially in the footprints books, it does build upon that vocabulary in the future. And also, it helps them know that these are words that you expect them to know how to spell properly. So a lot of times we're not really focused on spelling, but if there's words that we have spent an entire week going over, we do expect them to know how to spell it correctly. So if you are teaching the younger kids, a word wall is going to be really beneficial. What a word wall is essentially just putting up every vocabulary group. So if you're doing a vocabulary section on food, you would put all of your food words up on the wall with images ideally, so that the kids are able to associate the image with the word and then write the word correctly when they're using it. So this would be especially key for first, second, third grade, where they still are learning how to read in English. Just because they know how to read in Spanish doesn't mean that that translates to English. So it becomes really crucial with those grades. And then that way, once you teach them how to use the word wall, you can expect those words to be spelled correctly every single time they use them, because they're up in the classroom. So the kids can even go up and copy with their notebook and look up on the wall and copy down the word correctly. This eventually will turn into sight words so that the kids don't need the crutch of the wall. It's going to take different kids different amounts of time to get to that point. But then it's also really easy for you to review all the words because they're all up there in the classroom. Like I was saying before, I think in the first video, if you do want to do a word wall or you do want to be putting stuff up on in the classroom, you just would make a poster rather than just popping it up on the classroom wall by just gluing it up there itself.